And I mean, in some sense, this is really just an effort to resync. You've been a very busy person, and I haven't been completely docile for the past period of time. So we may have some useful new things.
I think so. There's some fundamental energy information syncing up that I think we can do. I also really enjoyed your stoa. I listened to the meta crisis and sovereignty as the forcing function. Remember that?
I vaguely remember participating in that. I don't have any recollection of the content.
Anyway, you did a nice job articulating sovereignty, meta crisis, and ways in which we might cultivate sovereignty, use the meta crisis as a forcing function. Cultivate sovereignty.
Indeed. Or be used by it, perhaps.
Or be used by it. But, so I appreciated that. And you did some stuff on John's eidetic education stuff, which you had a nice conversation with him on that. And
much of my attention over the past, let's call it 8 weeks, has been towards this broad category, roughly now being known as Web 3, in some sense also being known as the Metaverse.
Okay.
And being firmly Gen X, as are you, I know how words and the naming of things tends to happen.
Yeah. Okay.
I remember when there was an information superhighway, and when there was a series of tubes, and there was a World Wide Web, and various things like that, right? So I'm not sort of ensorcelled by the notion that somebody like Mark Zuckerberg might try to name and claim that metaverse.
Yep.
Nor by the notion that it's very well understood exactly what it is that we're referring to when we wave our hands in that direction.
Totally.
Right. And maybe this is so here's the point. Here's the conclusion. And it's not going to be at all surprising to you. This is just another way of saying something we've hit on many times, is that what I would say is that the notion or the content of the reference metaverse, and for the moment, I'll actually just collapse Web3 into that. Right? So I'm talking about a pointer, and there's a bunch of different things that are part of it.
Got it.
Actually, it's a question. It's a fork in the road. Right? So the nature, the meaning of the notion or the term metaverse is as yet undetermined. It for sure involves the resolution of the relationship between what in many places has been called the noosphere, or the virtual, or that thing that distinguishes humans from the rest of nature.
Which I call capital C culture and the culture person plane of existence.
The culture person plane of existence, right. It involves the resolution of that question of the relationship between that object and nature.
Yep.
Right? So the relationship between mind and body, to make it very simple. Along one path, the transhumanist path, to kind of give it a name, is the path of mind establishing dominion, and I mean that quite specifically, over body, over nature. I personally do not like this path. And then, but it's not the only path. Right? The other path is right relationship between mind and body, between and nature. One might say governed by or mediated by, held by, and in some sense representing soul. So there's an interesting whole thing going on here. From an aesthetic perspective, there's certain warm tones and warmth in this language.
It feels more coherently integrated.
More coherently integrated, yes. More wholesome.
Yes.
And more thriving. And one might, by the way, point out for those who are brass tacks, also more capable of actually enduring for any meaningful period of time. But that's
like the back half of the 21st century.
Right. So it's a little bit longer story, but and I think that's probably a conversation that's worth having more publicly and more broadly, because I feel right now that we're at a moment where, well, first, people are a little bit narrow in trying to understand the nature of this thing, metaverse. Like, is it VR goggles sold by Mark Zuckerberg? Categorically, no. But also, I guess, a little bit defeatist in terms of a feeling of an inevitability of the transhumanist path.
Yeah.
And while I'm certainly aware of the, how would I say, the transhumanist path is up by a lot of points at halftime, but it's only halftime.
We got work to do, but we do have some power. And
That's right.
We got a couple of secret weapons to still pull out.
So, talk to me about secret weapons.
Well, there's different kinds of coins and different kinds of energy information patterns that we might be able to decode.
So, as context, because I suspect with hope that we will actually share this more publicly.
Sure.
Gregg, you have been having conversations with a number of other folks for the first time. Right? New connections are being made, most notably Benita Roy and Forrest Landry. And as a bit of context, one of the challenges that and by the way, Eric Weinstein, have bemoaned over the past decade and a half is the ragtagness of the Rebel Alliance. The Empire, as empires do, has been very good at wearing shiny black leather and destroying worlds with Death Stars. Rebel Alliance has been extremely poor at even ordinary, like having conversation. Right. So it is quite hopeful for me that these conversations are now beginning to be had. And people are beginning to be able to learn how to orient their attention to the right conversation at the right person, and then have enough capacity, emotional, semantic, abstract, to be able to actually have that conversation and connect. And sort of this at the end of the day is our ultimate secret weapon.
Amen. Amen. Right. If we can find exactly that context and shared understanding to afford a participatory network that enables us to weave a tapestry together, and do so then to take the red pills together and be aware of what we're doing and with organization and clarity, then that's going to afford us a second half opportunity to win this game.
Right. That's right. Yeah. And then what do you call it? Kool-Aid drinking metaphors notwithstanding.
So yes, I've been having a number of conversations with a lot of different people lately. I had a conversation with, in addition, Paul Vanderklay, just put up on, and so that was really interesting.
Oh, very nice.
And got a chance. I mean, it was a private conversation with Benita, but I've been meaning to hook up with her for a while. She did a wonderful presentation at the STOA on the self, the origins of self, in a particular way that I thought complemented the stuff that John and Christopher and I had done in the elusive I. And I could see a lot of opportunities for us to, synergistically dance. And we were able to come together. And I knew that, a lot of people see my system, and rightfully so, as some meta systemic architecture, which is always, for many people, are more process oriented and rightfully skeptical of some obsessive compulsive, quasi-autistic like structure that I figured out how to solve everything. Now, as everybody just speaks this language, we're good, and that there's some dynamic there, but actually that's not really, we can process that aspect, but that is not all that this is, and it's certainly not all that this affords. So I was able to, I think we were able to build some bridges and watch a process dynamic approach resonate and sync up, and show also there's a lot of architecture about the self and its various facets in the models you use, the model I use, that really are very limited, like genuine disagreement, just different language, different emphasis. And so that's, to me, that's, here's another example of an integrated pluralism that could be framed as a, oh, no, we can't, but no can get framed as a, oh, wow, no, these are complementary structures. And if we can get a coherent integrated pluralism, where people are realizing that they're playing a part of the weave, a thread in the weave. And I had a pretty similar conversation with Forrest along those lines,
So there's, this is one of those, how would you call it? The thing is an example of the thing that it talks about.
Yep.
Right. So it should be the case. If you have one of these objects, these, let's just call them, I don't know, meta theories, just to kind of get it very roughly articulated. This particular kind, right? As you said, there's a distinction. There's a totalizing kind, that takes itself as a once and forever reification that has no evolution, evolvability built into it.
The ring to win.
Yeah, exactly. The one name.
One.
And then there's this other kind, right? The kind, for example, that you're representing. And the whole point is Benita is, and Forrest is, and, right?
Right.
And what should happen is from the middle, when these encounter each other, there should be a way from their own way of being, from their own nature, of noticing the fact that the other is the same kind of thing, yes, by definition, coming from a different place, and therefore having a different way of doing what it does. But intrinsic to each one of these kinds of operators is a capacity to develop a bespoke protocol for communication and harmonization, which then generates an instance of integration and connection that, again, is never totalizing. Right? It doesn't collapse anything. It just creates more, like a richer, deeper weave and tapestry.
Exactly. And that, my friend, is a wonderful description of what if we can achieve this thing and make those kinds of connections, that's going to be central to it, and this integrated pluralism, this new kind of sensibility, which I feel super intimately with John now in terms of just a, so a real genuine synergy between two meta theories, that were completely developed independently of one another, that now have lock and key. I would at least, so I don't want to speak for John, but for me, a lock and key synergy, which I don't know has ever been done before. And it'd be interesting to know in sort of the history of ideas, because the old modernist structures were not systematically oriented in an integrated pluralistic. It was, I'm going to build a justification system, and then you enter into it, and then that works, and then then it's just competing between other systems of justification.
You can
doesn't have,
synthesize. Exactly. Okay, I've got mine, you've got yours. I'm going to throw away 30% of mine. You're going to throw away 40% of yours. We're kind of like glue them together into a new one. And that's the meta move. I'll create a meta system, which is the synthesis of two lower level systems, but it's not this integrative pluralism. Right? Maybe at this point, it's actually worthwhile just spending a little bit of time on the distinction between those two notions. It ends up being quite decisive if you really can grasp how this, for example, categorically resolves the sort of old-fashioned conflict between individualism and collectivism, which is just like a modernist artifact, which is not relevant in this new context. I know that's sort of very helpful. Like lots of people are like, oh, okay, cool. I can just throw out that whole conflict, no longer relevant. What's happening in this new context?
Totally. So for me, in fact, the basic idea of an integrated pluralism, and by the way, I heard Jim Rutt call it a coherent pluralism. Sometimes I'll add coherent integrated pluralism together. Okay. But basically, there's an appreciation of a dialectic between some sort of epicenter, integrating function and a perspectival, pluralistic, diverse shift that affords sort of this dynamic interrelation, which of course sort of just makes sense in my system. You're going to have different entities coming up as spectralizing different elements, of some sort of potentially shared ground. All right. And then what was before was sort of like an argument that you're going to build a system of justification that maps the territory and then kind of is a pristine modernist notion. If we think about this, it has to be reasoned, and it's based on accuracy, and it's based on analysis, and it's going to have truth value or not, and then it's going to be in competition with others, and then they'll battle and maybe break up. But really, I just see them basically sitting there as independent paradigms, as they're making truth claims. You then get the postmodern structure coming along and critiquing, which basically says, all of that is immanent contextual justification, meaning you guys are saying you're developing your pure systems, right? But really, we think Nietzsche as the first postmodern, it's the psychology of the philosopher that's 90% of the goddamn system, And it's all just a justification of whatever dynamics they're dealing with. They say it's some pristine metaphysics, but it's basically their perspective in the world, right? And then we can extrapolate that to a crass postmodern view. It's like it's all fucking justification. It's all just a immanent context of power and justification, and there's no ground upon which you would then afford any legitimizing function, which then, of course, in its extreme, says, well, there's no claims to be made at all, and they're all relatively equal, et cetera. And then, of course, that's kind of absurd.
Right.
And so the meta-modern integrative pluralistic sensibility is, hey, we all are aspectualizing different, pieces of the elephant in a particular kind of way, right? The blind men and the elephant metaphor. We're going to aspectualize, we're going to see various elements, and then we were going to weave together and see how these synergistically pluralistic perspectives may afford a coherent, integrated understanding and appreciate the diversity while also having a shared context of richness and growth. And that sensibility seems to me to be far superior in a synthetic synthesis Hegelian sort of way from modernity and its justification, rationality, and postmodernity is all justification, context, BS, to an integrated pluralism that then affords a collective intelligence sense-making, especially if we add the Zoom dialogos to it. So Zoom dialogos, unlike the old where you had to just write shit, right? So I'm an academic.
Zoom, like this thing right here.
Like this right here, yeah. Zoom dialogos is like, so I can now call Benita. So in the old days, if we were both academics, I'd publish something and then she would publish a critique of my meta-systemic structure because it's the wrong direction to go, right? And then I'm like, oh God, now I have to game A that thing and undermine that and justify why my justification system in writing in a context of competition of, swords of academia. Right. And now it's like, oh, call somebody and be like, actually, that's true in some ways, but that's not my full emphasis. And I love the fact that you're going that way. And actually, oh, really? Oh, yeah, because actually, I think this is good and this is really complementary. Oh, so a face-to-face dialogos that affords the capacity to, have an oral indigenous relationship, feed back on each other, make corrections immediately in real time. It's totally different than the old game of refined publication so that you get a defense of a particular position in writing where you're basically, there's no iterative immediate feedback process, which is a dialogue is so unbelievably good at. So it's this dialogos thing from an academic perspective and affording this capacity to build rich relations and an integrated pluralistic understanding. Now we can build on some of the digital metaverse shit as a game, as a medium potential game changer if we can turn it into a strength. And I think that this is one of the things that afford that.
So as an exercise, hold on one second. There we go. Okay. As an exercise in self-referentiality, I will this is the old internet, ping ack. I will or I will take what you just provided, I will metabolize it, and I will not vomit, but articulate, express back out something. But the meta point is then to say, okay, cool, what we're doing is we're orienting in a trans, to use for a specific language, a transcendent location by means of the real relationality of this Zoom dialogos environment and the sort of pointer complex, right, of the semantic terms that we happen to be using and broadly speaking share. Exactly. So a couple of points, like one point is the role of media. And you mentioned that in the old days, we might even say modernity is a consequence of books, or the consequence of print, both as an opportunity and a constraint, right? You could now communicate with a much larger group of people over a longer period of time than just the local individuals that you could interact with in conversation. But you couldn't have the context relevance, right? The relational possibilities, both at the EQ level, as well as in terms of just the semantic requirements of what context provides, right? So you were this new milieu of that sort of behavior, that sort of justification system that was selected for effectiveness in the context of book became a kind of artifact that began to generate and attract human attention and energy and to coordinate more and more choices and behaviors to the degree to which we were beginning to explore the potentials that it afforded, which of course were many. Right? For example, much of the scientific enterprise is no more or less than the fact that you can begin to collaborate with people that you don't know by means of appropriately structured text. And concepts like peer review, much maligned in some quarters, which appropriately, are basically just a simple technology to say, okay, well, how do we deal with the problems and the possibilities of decontextualized, relatively broadcast, tight semantic articulations? Okay, cool. We're make it more effective than that. Exactly. All right, that's 1. 2. This notion of the in the larger context, many of the things are happening. We have people are having kids, people are making money. More specifically, there's this wave that's been going on. I'm by the way, now I'm back at like Gutenberg, roughly speaking. So at that point, people were fighting fights. People were conquering. That's the better word. We're conquering and defending territory. That was already happening. That was a whole wave. It was kind of its own sort of movement to it. And books enters into this field, and it changes the terms of that field, and does not sort of cause it to disappear, but the form of the kingdom that is appropriate and possible in a pre-literate environment is not the form of a kingdom that is possible and appropriate in a post-literate environment. Right? The ability to send dispatches that can communicate to further governors, right? The British Empire was produced as the consequence of the ability to actually figure out how could you effectively coordinate and deploy force and power economically, diplomatically, and kinetically by means of the written word. Right? And that's what it is. There's an organ for doing that kind of thing.
Completely.
So we say, we're in the process of a technological disruption at least as significant as the book. Obviously, I would say much more so. One affordance of which is this notion of real-time, highly contextual, high relational conversation. Zoom dialogos. I like, by the way, the implication of Zoom as an adjective as well as a noun, which changes the state of the game. We don't have to engage in the kinds of things that happen in the decontextualized written word form. We can and should and will inevitably will engage in a different style of interaction. Right. And it gives rise to a completely different form of coordination, which is now well understood in the thing named Web3. They don't yet, I don't think, understand why, like what is it that they're actually in service to, or what is the real potential? What are the design characteristics of what the potential looks like on its interior as it develops? But they're aware of the fact that they are actually dealing with a new level of coordination, and that portends much. Back to Rebel Alliance and stealing a win here in the winning seconds.
Right.
Okay, hold on. And much of the criticism of postmodernism is accurate. There is an intrinsic, it's funny, I'll just use the language from postmodernism, intrinsic totalizing characteristic that is associated with the model or the approach of book, right? Of written word. As you say, it's sort of because the rate of communication, the context, decontextualization of it, there's a need actually to form a paradigm, right? Kuhn, the paradigm is an artifact of this point in time, I would say. I'm going to propose that as specific.
That's a yes.
This is actually, by the way, I had this thought a long time ago, but I sort of embedded Kuhn inside Foucault. And so my proposition is Foucault's concept of the episteme is more fundamental than Kuhn's concept of the paradigm. That the paradigm is a form appropriate to the episteme of the moment of that.
Nice. I could totally see that. Yep.
And it has to do with things like the translation cost of different kinds of language. If I'm building a new, let's say I'm doing just like chemistry, and I've got terms in chemistry that other people don't know. And it's costly to learn a new term. It's not trivial and very confusing if you don't know what the terms mean, right? And so
just ask people trying to learn this thing.
Yeah, well, exactly. So to the point, let's hold that actually as a good model. So the old-fashioned way of doing it is you create a dictionary. Right? You'd say, okay, well, here's the official fucking meaning of the terms. If you need to know what they mean, go here. We've created a formal, totalizing, centralized construct that has hierarchical domination over the meanings of these words. If you disagree, fuck you. You're out of the team. You're not on the board. And here's what it looks like. But if we all agree to this sort of finite construct, then we can coordinate using these hyper decontextualized written constructs. Right? If you haven't got any context, you can't be like, wait a minute, hold on. Wait, what did you mean by that? That sounded weird to me. If you can't do that at all, then you literally either you just don't communicate, or you have to have some kind of totalizing construct that defines what is valid discourse within a particular paradigmatic frame, right? That's that. Just the consequence, right? There's no sort of here nor there. That's just what happens. And similarly, that same thing works at the level of political power. If I want to be able to effectively coordinate economic, financial, kinetic, diplomatic energy across some spatial location, I have to have I have to control the definitions of the meanings of the words within that particular communications milieu. Otherwise, I'm saying, sell, the guy on the other side's like, oh, that means buy. That doesn't work, right? You have to have agreement of what it means. We all have to have a shared dictionary of what terms mean within some level of rigor, right? And that, of course, required that each sort of sphere of influence, which largely, of course, became linguistic, the notion of a nation as being effectively the playing out of a particular linguistic and therefore ethnocultural, but linguistic constraint. And remember, the French formally, we now have a formal institute that does nothing but precisely define every single word.
Right.
They kind of got the essence of it pretty precisely. That's just it, right? That's just how it works out. And so then, of course, as you say, we end up kind of in this wrestling match of no, my definitions are more right than your definitions, or are right and your definitions are wrong. And therefore you have to play on my turf because I don't want to be playing in your turf. And the strict kind of subordinate construct, which makes people a little bit, which gives rise to things like individual versus collectivist. And a collectivist relationship is precisely the subordination of my experiences, my meaning, my understanding to some kind of formal construct that is necessary for shared communication. Hold on. See if I can make this less choppy. On the right network? I'm on the right network. All right, well, we can do. Okay, so then we end up with the new thing, this new milieu, new possibility. It sits on top of the old. So one thing is that we're part of the essence of the new is that the old happened. We're aware of it. It's not we're not having to invent it from. Like, okay, got it. I understand all that. That was part of how things happened. I've kind of learned those lessons as humans tend to, the hard way. Okay, and we're sitting in a very different potential. Right? If I have not only the tension. Not only can I call you and disambiguate and have relational context, but also I have to because the power, the possibility of some sort of formal. Man, this is a pain. What's happening? Why is that happening? I'm seeing you like go on and off, just like completely red. Are you having the same thing on my end?
Okay. I'm having a bit of I'm definitely tracking you, but it's, we got it. We have some interference.
I don't know. On my end, everything seems very strong. Let's see if I'm going to shift to a different network.
Check mine. Mine's.
Okay, let's see if that makes a difference. So far, so nope, not at all. It may be on your end. So let's see. Right. So not only can I now engage in a Zoom dialogos when there's a moment of ambiguity, but also in fact have to, because everybody's involved in the conversation. And I'm going to terminate the call and start it again.
Perfect. Do you want to send me a Zoom link?
Yep.
On?
I'll send you.
Send me a Zoom link. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, to the point. Every new thing has its own pluses and minuses. So here's one. Well, there's many, right? You take a look at how Twitter operates. So one of the point I was making earlier is that we now, of course, this is the story of the building up of the internet. We have this. Oh, come on now. That's a weird modifier. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Okay.
My computer. There we go. Okay. What do they call it? Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, like, everybody has a printing press, that kind of a thing. It went from 3 channels on TV, 2,000 channels to now everybody at that point. The idea that in Twitter, everybody is somewhat symmetric in their capacity to participate in the conversation. They're not actually, because number of followers and algorithmic throttling and things like that, but it's a different environment, which means the tech, this is back to one of my theses, right? The notion, the technology, the institutional framework of the Blue Church, which evolved to regulate the mechanics of coordination and paradigmatic formation in the context of mass media communication, right? Breaks down, has broken down, and is accelerating in its breakdown. Because it wasn't evolved for this particular environment. This niche is a very different niche. So we're in the process, successfully or not, of course you can always fail to adapt to your niche, of evolving a new form of how we do this sort of thing in this new potential, in this new environment. And to loop all the way back, this new environment is one that you're calling sometimes coherent integrative pluralism. And it has characteristics of neither needing nor requiring a subordination on the part of members of the dialogue. I'm not playing your game, you're not playing my game. We are afforded the possibility and the potential of producing a novel game bespoke, right? Every relationship is its own play, which has as a consequence the enriching of both of our games intrinsically.
Totally.
Which is why we continue to play. And I would say meta enriching, because since that underlying piece is so powerful, it also produces synergistic value, or the we call it the anti-rivalrous consequence, that as you and I, for example, play in this way and thereby enrich our own capacities, it produces a higher degree of potential in every other possible game we might play.
Totally.
Right? So by talking with Gregg, I actually become a more valuable player in the larger game for literally everybody else. And if you sort of just multiply that out, that gets, from a process perspective, the shape of that curve is very steep. It's absurdly steep, actually. This begs the question of the singularity, but we'll ignore that for the moment. Right. So let's see.
So I'll just to riff off that a little bit, if I put it a little bit in talk language, where the old relationship, these systems of justification that we operate under and are subordinate to. Okay.
Yep.
So then you get modernity, you get basically the tribe, and then the civilization, and then it's dictating into traditional civilization, and then we get into refined knowledge, and we get science. But modernity is still basically creating systems of justification that you're subordinate to at various levels. Okay. Postmodernism sort of comes along and says, well, it's all power, but it's still basically then like a battle of justification in a particular way. We are actually now at a place we're not going to like teleport out of justification, but we can get adjacent to justification in a different kind of way. We can relate to these systems of justification through, here you are aspectualizing a particular part of the whole, through your narrative and propositional structure. And I can relate to you where you are in that. And then I share where I am in that. And now, rather than trying to then think about, okay, there are no point of justification, or we're going to subordinate ourselves, we're going to be like, we're in an integrated pluralistic system of justification that we can be adjacent to, participate in, but not necessarily force some sort of.
Yeah. And there's so your definition of ego, what the ego is, right? We have a bit of a historical ambiguity. Freud uses it differently than the Buddhists do. So we're going to use the Gregg Henriques version of it, which I quite like, which is the kind of the human neurocognitive faculty for producing systems of justification.
Exactly.
All right, great. And the sort of the classic problem is the one where you yourself subordinate yourself to your own ego, right? The ego self inversion.
Yep.
And the social version of that is the same kind of thing, right? So if Jordan's ego is interacting with Gregg's ego, and Jordan's ego is subordinating Jordan's self, and Gregg's ego is subordinating Gregg's self, boom, we're locked into this entire set of cascade effects that produce these sort of dominant structures. This is, by the way, a very clean way of describing the transformation into game A from my perspective.
Totally.
Okay. So what we're noticing is that we can notice that there's an individual version of this form of just proper relationship. Oh, systems of justification are a thing. Nice. But they're not the whole thing. Right? They're a map. They're not the territory. And there is a territory. How do I know? Well, the ego is a thing. It's not the whole thing. There's a self. How do I know? Because I do. I can just, here I am, there's a self. I can begin to get very, very clean distinctions between them by a variety of practices. In my case, it happened to be meditation. And okay, well, that affords us a whole new possibility. We no longer have to imagine that this game is just a kind of a winner takes all slugfest of power, manipulation, and justification. But actually, there's a ground, there's a self. Systems of justification are a tool for coordination between things that are outside of the scope of the systems of justification, like, say, trees and humans. Brilliant. And this is back, by the way, to the fork, transhumanism and this other thing.
Yes, right. And I would then say what modernity did, and then capital labor relations created a system of justification. This gets into the conversation I was having with Forrest. Systems of justification that then are instrumental, result in a power law distribution of influence in a particular kind of way, and that fundamentally miscalibrates the actual heart, which actually should be ideally calibrated on relational value rather than social influence. And one of our tasks in this transformation is to recalibrate a power law distribution of influence into a more Gaussian distribution of relational value and connection in that regard. So in terms of the kinds of moves that we want to be making relative to modernity, we want to get adjacent to our justification, see the monsters that we created and all the power that they did, diagnose them in a particular way, and then rotate. If we're able to weave this together, this will afford us the capacity to win this game.
Yep. Okay. So I want to double click on that. It's a profoundly powerful construct and insight. Again, one of these things that enables us to be liberated from things that in many ways can be depressing constraints. So what you just said is something like this. Pareto distributions are yes, they happen, but they're an artifact of a particular form of social relationship, right? So if you have a social relationship that operates in a certain way, which I call it society. Right?
Beautiful.
You have a society, and we can sort of describe that in more detail. If you have a society, then you're going to have Pareto distributions of social relationships. Kind of done. But that's not the only kind of relationality. In fact, it's not even the more fundamental, right? The more basic, more fundamental kind of relationality, which I just call community, just to make a distinction, doesn't have a Pareto distribution as its equilibrium.
Right.
There's a Gaussian distribution as its equilibrium. If you can land on that, like if you're a person who spends time in places like economics or in politics, you care about justice, this distinction is super profound. Right? It describes the fact that there's a way to achieve a kind of quality of relationship that we would define as, say, justice or fairness or equity. There's an actual way to get there, right? You can't get there staying inside the form of society. If you stay inside the form of society, you're never going to get there. It's not a thing. So you have to go down and over into this other form. But once you get to this other form, not only is it possible, it's actually the equilibrium state. And that's the power of this approach of being able to say, okay, I agree. we don't like this particular structure, this way this structure plays out. But how is this, like, what is it? Say hello to the new boss, same as the old boss. If you think that just by killing the king and installing yourself as king, you're changing the nature, you're not. But there is a different place, and it's not imaginary, right? It's not the kind of the communist mid-century, failure of, oh, not getting the thing, and there's a place. So let's just talk about, like, why is there a Pareto distribution in this thing I'm calling society? And what do I, when I say society, what is it I'm really talking about? What do I mean?
Yeah. First off, lovely. Yeah. I mean, the short answer, one short answer is money and influence beget money and influence. Okay. So as you have more opportunity to gain control, and there are lots of different, this Pareto distribution basically is that a small number of individuals acquire an enormous disproportionality of influence and control, okay, and a power kind of law distribution. So for folks that don't know what that is, that's the essence of it. And then it creates a massive inequality. And we have seen that in our society, in virtually any context, in any societal organization tends to drift into these Pareto distributions. They're very difficult to prevent. And there are reasons why that we can dialogue about, but I don't know that that's crucial. For me, the issue is that when you get this, that's going to create all sorts of problems. Okay. The focus is on influence of our modernity. We create capital labor. What we're basically trying to do is actually observable work effort, and our science orients us in this perspective, which I think is a deep mistake. One of the things that our enlightenment is that we don't get human nature right here. And we can talk about what the distinction is, my own history of social influence, relational value, et cetera. But it's the felt sense of being known and valued is our core. That's crucial. We certainly track social influence, but that's another aspect. And we miss this. Psychology misses this. The humanists sort of get it. But anyway, the point what you made, we can actually see in the world. I want to bid people, all you need to do is you go back to hunter-gatherer oral indigenous structures. The vast majority of oral indigenous structures are about building community, okay? And guess what? Narcissistic ego shit is regulated deeply in that structure. They do not want people pulling out what's called the blue line on the influence matrix. I'm superior and I'm going to egoically control your ass through power. They regulate that. Virtually every community society figures out structures to regulate it. Okay. So then what happens is we basically release that thing. In game A world, we release that thing. The society and the Pareto distribution and nature, power, and influence afford a capacity, even our justifications release that thing. So what we are saying is that, oh my God, if we then invest in that societal structure in particular, well, that's what you get game A. And you can't just kill that. You actually need to, what is the kind of structure that's actually sustainable? Actually, if we look at this and we actually create a particular type of oral indigenous dialogos kind of dynamic that is a fundamentally different dynamic with this ego as power issue, well, then maybe we have something serious going on here.
Yeah. So what I would say, and I think you're going to agree with me on this, is that we've actually produced a lot of good language to describe the thing that I'm calling society, or specifically the thing that more fundamentally I'm calling game A, which has to do with the prioritization, almost obligate mediation of relationality by means of ego. That's a very clean way of articulating it. Now, what's happening there? Well, what's happening there is the ego, at the end of the day, is a finite state machine. Right? If you understand that from a computational perspective, things lit up. Yeah. If you think about it, money, right? Money is a finite state machine. It's very, has a large amount of processing power. That's why it's functional. It's what markets do, right? Markets are a massively parallel information processing machine, but it's a finite state machine. Right? And ego works very functionally inside money. Money and ego connect quite nicely. Right? There's a reason why narcissistic egoic personalities perform very well, and they tend to rise to the top of the Pareto distribution. The 80-20 rule is a common vernacular for that. When one mediates complexity, when one mediates rich, highly contextualized relationships by means of the complicated, by means of finite state machines, even very large ones, one is operating in the form that I'm calling society, and therefore has by implication for sure guaranteed things like Pareto distributions.
Yep.
and for sure guaranteed things like a infinite cascade effect in paradigmatic interrelational communication, right? Because you now have to find some way of doing some translation between your finite state machine and my finite state machine, which means that if I have a small deviation in the way that my state machine maps a particular context from yours, we actually can't engage in any real communication. Either I have to learn yours, which is what education has become. Education has become a machine for stamping shared paradigmatic models on minds, which has as an ancillary benefit training selves to become egos,
socialize them into the system,
and of course training egos to become narcissists, right? Of course, right? So it's not, if you understand how these system dynamics work, it's not confusing how we got where we are, and frankly where we are. Like where we are is like, oh yeah, I know where we are, and I know how we got here, and how we get out of it becomes, oh, okay, to get out of it, as you say, we need to say human nature isn't the kind of thing that was written about in the Enlightenment. Neither Rousseau nor Voltaire nor any of those guys were frankly close. We've got some pretty good ideas. More importantly, we've got good models. Right? As you say, the oral indigenous cultures tell us what it looks like. And there it is. Those are humans operating according to human nature, more or less. We can do a diff across a very large number and get a nice, basic model. And now double clicking on my fork in the metaverse, and we're entering into a new milieu. We are in fact post-literate. We're not an oral culture, we're a literate culture, decreasingly, and maybe that's to the best. But we're also a Zoom dialogos, Zoom dialogos culture, almost certainly. I don't think that there's a path where we drop back down into a pre-electrical civilization. Well, I mean,
I don't like that path.
And land. Right? There's a lot of paths where we do that, but we don't land. Just keep going. Way past oral indigenous. But there is a path where we find this new higher tone of human nature, establishing right relationship with this thing, the virtual, right? The virtual per se. And this is the key, right? This is the point of the metaverse. The metaverse is where we actually look at the notion of technology in the eye directly.
Exactly.
Right? We're not looking at like a pair of eyeglasses.
Right.
We're not looking at a pen. Right. We're not even looking at a cell phone. Right. We're actually looking at the essence of technology directly. And asking, what's the relationship here? Because if we want to play the narcissist ego finite state machine game, AI wins.
Yep.
AI is better at playing that than any human mind will ever be. And Elon Musk's gambit is, well, let's just become AI. Like the only game in town is for us to just do that. Which if you don't have the rest of this theory, it's going to make sense. That's what you'll get to. Our proposition is that no, there's actually a whole other kind of game that we can play. Right? One that is not a relationship where we are operating and coordinating by means of ego, by means of systems of justification. We're aware of systems of justification being a thing. We're aware of ego being a thing, but we're actually held in a much larger, richer, fully contextualized world called reality. And in reality, we can actually reposition technology in its proper location.
Beautifully said.
Easier said than done.
Oh, well, right, we didn't win the game as a function of it, but it was brilliantly articulated.
Right. This is the halftime, right? This coach at halftime saying, all right,
this is the halftime speech.
Now there's a play. Then now the game actually played out. But that's like that's how it draws up, right? You got
exactly
team algorithm, right? Team. What did I call it one time? I call them team godless communists, just to kind of use a nice mid-century Americana, which is just algorithm, just another way of saying the same thing, right? Team ego, team narcissist, team finite state machine, team society, team systems of domination, team can't get outside of your own system of justification and bullshit yourself into meaninglessness, right? It's all that team. Right. We're on that side. And then team human, team soul, team self, team context, team complexity, team nature and technology in wholesome relationship, right? Therein lies that's the fork. That's the fork of the metaverse, as I'm calling it.
That's right.
Call it right now. That's the fork in the metaverse. And bing, 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 as we said, the potency, the expansion of the field of possibility that emerges in this new kind of Zoom dialogos, in this new form of generative, integrative pluralism is our secret weapon. And it's qualitatively vaster. It's a different order of infinity than is possible in principle in the algorithmic domain.
Definitely. Actually, yeah. So let me take a slight right turn and come back to this, okay? Because you said secret weapon, and I totally agree, but I want to add some things to that weapon, okay? Which part of through the integrated pluralism that I really feel is emerging is the intellectual groundwork for a new enlightenment, which affords the intellectual architecture in addition, to the sensibility and the media and the axioms and whatnot, in addition. So if we can also analytically diagnose the justificatory histories, okay, and demonstrate where the human nature shit got wrong and what science did and what that was wrong, and then upgrade it and say, oh, well, now we know that was wrong, and now this is what right is, in a way that, a 15-year-old can totally then narrate and understand with reliability and validity and clarity.
Yep.
Okay. Then you're in a different kind of place in terms of what affords the capacity to spread the system, because if we can get it right, that the diagnosis and the upgrade analytically is clear, as well as the cultural flavor, and then that affords, not that we subordinate to it, but clear justification about what this path is relative to our past in an analytic way, that will afford additional momentum and capacity in getting our shit together.
Yes, particularly among those for whom analytic
exactly
assessment is a key component,
right? Which is definitely not everybody, but in relationship to a coordinating function, it could play a central coordinating function in relationship.
Great, yeah, I agree. The challenge, of course, and this is why people like you and John play an important role, is ego defense, narcissism. Various forms of fragile ego, and the unwillingness to, well, it's funny, let's just be very precise, the degree to which the ego has effectively colonized the self and protect its territory, using the technique the ego is very good at using.
It's a good justifier.
So, if you happen to be an individual who is kind of affordant to analytical methodologies for perceiving and making sense of the world and then making choices, notice that this thing we're describing, ego, may have pwned you at some point in time. You may be particularly challenged in unpwning yourself because your primary faculties, or this capacity to engage in this particular mode of thinking, happens to be one that is particularly gameable by the ego. So you're sort of relying on something which itself doesn't have your best interests in mind and lives inside you and uses your own, perhaps in some cases, tremendous capacity to justify itself, which is what it does first and foremost. In all circumstances, the one thing it justifies more than anything else is that it's your best buddy and really needs to be in charge. And of course, can play all the various games of fear and shame and depression, all those other elements, right? It has fingers very firmly on buttons that it's surrounded with systems of justification in your interior. So for that portion, and here in many cases, I'm often speaking to technologists creating Web3, you got some work. You're going to have to actually step through this particular portal. I can tell you, I'm of that type, and I saw this, thought it through very clearly, and then bootstrap myself through the portal to some extent, not particularly effectively, but better than zero. So it can be done. And I would say also should and must be done for path 2 to have liftoff, right? That's right there. Crucial. What's the other piece of it? The analytic possibility. The other possibility, of course, just speaks to John's video series, The Meaning Crisis.
Right.
This left-hand side is just another way of saying the meaning crisis.
Totally. The
algorithmic transhumanist thing is just cotton candy, man. You're not getting nutrition. You're the hole in your soul.
Bad calories. And if the meaning and mental health crisis, and you look out across our adolescence these days, and that doesn't think that maybe those are not the healthiest developmental calories we should be chewing, if that doesn't make your skin get a little bit iffy,
right?
Then, the data are pretty clear, people.
Yep.
Not
bad
good.
Calories.
Bad calories.
So the other side, right? There is a better way, right?
There's a better way.
There's a thing where your soul is nurtured, right? There's this thing where you yourself is seen and met.
That's right.
There's a place.
Get your soul and spirit in right relation to the real, natural, relational, technological world we are in.
Yep. So that's the other, there are other people for whom those words are the ones. And of course, we're all part of the same whole. So all the different people and all the different words, so they can all be heard. And again, the beauty, of course, here is then we get this integrative pluralism. Different people can bring their perspective and their aesthetics and the things that they have seen and the beautiful aspects of reality that they've discovered and have found that are most precious, and bring them forward and share them for the nurturing and growth and development of each other, which throws off this gigantic explosion of potential lurking just on the other side of the what is it called? The eye of the needle. Right? Just on the other side of the eye of the needle. If you just go through it, tricky business, right? We say you're gonna have to leave money behind. You have to leave, and I don't mean like your personal money, I mean money as a concept.
Money's context. That's a little toxic.
At least as the primary mechanism for mediating coordination. I don't know if money has no role in the future.
No, right. But as the central bottom line.
Yeah, exactly. As the bottom line, no. And not even necessarily part of one of a triple bottom line, but as a piece of a much larger tapestry that we are really using, the whole complex whole, as reality always is, right?
Totally.
So you and Forrest synced up on that, which is really good. Like, it's such a nice thing to have that as a proof, like it's provable. You can do a proof on this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I consider us, we synced up to start a real journey of real deep analytic deconstruction and reconstruction relation. So I'm really looking forward.
Yeah,
so it's going to be good. There's one other thing. I don't know how you got. So what do you have? What's your time frame?
I'm on borrowed time right now, but everybody's out and about. So let's keep going.
All right. So here's I want to drop this in and see how this, because this came. I wanted to share this with you. I listened to your last conversation on energy information and
with Matthew.
With Matthew.
Yeah.
Okay. And I wish I had more background on him. So some of his proof of work concepts were not, I had to infer quite a bit in relationship to sense making for the conversation.
Yep.
All right. But I definitely look forward to syncing him up with him. And I wanted to then share with you some of the stuff that I've been doing somewhat with John on my own, some coin stuff. Okay. So with the iQuad coin, and connecting, as I heard him talk about the ribosome and those kinds of issues, and the way in which, sort of the fundamental basement on energy necessary for information, and then what information is. So I'm working on the idea. I was working with John, and I was sort of like, I hooked on to this imaginal, okay? Concept of the imaginal, all right? Concept of the imaginal, John emphasizes this as a differentiation between imaginary, so fully imaginary is stuff that's not. Imaginal then is in this intermediate space, okay? Whereby you're representing something, but then in representing it, you afford potential in utilizing it for seeing things you hadn't seen before, okay? And that, all of a sudden, that hit me in a particular kind of way, all right? All right. Whereby I realized the concept of imaginal creates a beautiful intermediate space between what we might call the experience of the real. So my perception of this can. This is a can of Dr. Pepper, okay? And we can say, well, that's real at whatever level of construction. I have a visual image of that, but I see something that's real, I'll call it Dr. Pepper, okay? And then I can have it in my head. I can have an image of that. Yes, it corresponds to the real. Then I can imagine the Dr. Pepper moving around, okay? And wonder what it's like to drink, and it's still potentially an imaginal space. And then I can have it sprout wings like a fairy and fly off and call that imaginary.
Okay.
Okay. So what does that do? That creates a kind of a continuum of my immediate experience of the real in my virtual, experiential system, like as I'm experiencing what the hell's going on inside my head, but my subjective conscious experience of being of the real, we'll call that the imaginal real. Okay, so it's an imaginal direct representation. Then imaginal would be possible, okay, space, and then a full imaginary would then be in the space of the counterfactual impossible.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So now this issue of imaginal became a dimension around a way of information processing, specifying a dimension of its relationship to, so you have the information processor, and it's relating to the environment in a particular kind of weird way on a continuum of the imaginal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, whereby the tightest aspects are where this imaginal real is really in good complex looping with what's ever out here, versus, okay, then imaginal and then imaginary.
Yeah.
All right. And you notice that I'm doing this dimension thing here. I'm creating a Y dimension up here, okay, that's then tracking the thing that it's tracking. So this is the can out in the world, and then this is my experience of it immediately, and then as I go up, okay, in the imaginary. All right. All right, so here's the reason that I'm doing this, okay? This is that I believe that there is a deep relationship between what I just specified at the level of the imaginal and the real, and the relationship between real numbers and imaginary numbers.
Oh, crap. Okay.
Okay. In the way in which mathematics thinks about imaginary numbers as being orthogonal to the real numbers. Okay. And the way in which then when you do an imaginary and real, you get a complex number plane. Okay. All right. So here's now a working map. There's an imaginal layer of information processing in a subject, okay, that corresponds then, that's embedded in the real world. All right. There's a dimension upon which there's the mapping of that, whereby you engage in an interactive system that you can then call the complex transjective interactive, which is basically as my imaginal system is connecting with the real, then there will be a complex interface.
Okay.
All right. I'm believing that we may have then a way to take the topology of imaginary and real numbers and complex numbers, okay, and basically impute that onto, oh, the shit that happens inside my head is akin to an imaginal dimension relative to the real. And then I interface that in a complex transjective plane.
Sorry, man. I cannot follow. And I don't mean in any way to say I disagree. I literally, like when you heard me say, oh shit, like when you interjected the complex numbers or the imaginary numbers, I don't know. I cannot follow down that particular rabbit hole.
I'll try one more little thing and let's see, and then we can drop this. Okay.
But
so you know
there's some stuff here that I'd like to feed back to you that connects back to my conversation with Matthew, and it may loop, right? There may be something that happens to it, or it may be that we actually have to do this triadically, for example.
Okay. All right. So so I was trying to explain this to my parents. So first you have sort of energy, and then you have matter. Okay. Then I have the life, mind, and culture that are coming off of matter.
Okay.
Right, in the tree of knowledge, right? Okay. So life, then really what I'm representing with life is the complex adaptive plane of information processing and communication that give rise to this complex network. Okay. The semantic content of life then is being thought of as an imaginary orthogonal dimension to matter.
Okay. So can I say that slightly differently?
Please.
Can I say that it is transcendent. And again, in kind of like the Landry sense, or in the sense of like a Kantian sense even.
Sure.
Okay, and we're saying more or less the same thing.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yep.
So to say the language back, and this is all right. So actually, let me kind of interrupt. Let's do it more like this.
Yep.
Oops, we can do this very easily. I got a real cow, and I got a real bucket, and I need to tell you, hey, would you mind taking that bucket over to that cow and milk the cow? Now we have this really cool thing where I can replace the actual physical real cow, which is heavy and over there, with this sound cow, which resembles it in many ways, not at all.
Totally.
And yet enables us to coordinate our orientation so that shit can happen. Now, if I draw it on paper, this is sort of classic semiotics. I'll draw a picture of a cow, which is already a representation. I've got the word cow, and they are both pointing to something that is real, but it is transcendent. Right? It is neither the physical embodied actual metabolic cow or the sound cow, and yet there's a way for them to be pointing at the same kind of thing, which you're now saying that's at the imaginary, that is, or the imaginal, that is in the imaginal plane, the imaginal mode. Yes, okay. And then we have three things, right? First is that can happen. That's part of the universe we live in, is that can happen. The second is that there's an energetic benefit and an energetic cost associated with that move. The cost is the information processor that has the capacity to do whatever sorts of sort of perception, disambiguation, pattern recognition work necessary to be able to map two perceptons to each other. The energetic savings, the energetic benefit is what you can do when you don't have to actually physically walk over and touch the cow and wave the bucket around, but can actually just issue the sentence. Yeah. Totally. And so there's sort of this trade-off, brain, right? The innovation of brain is the discovery of the potential available when you have an organ of information processing potential of a brain that can then use systems of justification linguistically to coordinate them into a distributed cognition function, which enables an unlocking of a tremendous amount of information compression in the transcendent or in the imaginal space, which is what we're doing right now. All right, so
brilliant.
Page?
Yeah. So now, right. So now what the tree of knowledge saying is that you look at a life, and that life, the semantics of life at the cell level, the RNA, DNA, when he's describing the ribosome. Yep. So that information store that affords the complex dynamics of a cell to make its decisions in relation is I life, imaginal life. It's the semantics of that then can't be reduced to the fucking matter, because it's this instantiated modeling of matter, and it communicates at this network binded level. So that then affords us that what is the semantic binding that's modeling the reality through this information network that then is doing it based on energy constraints, as he was talking about. So it's the information relative to energy constraint. Yep. And then that's the cell DNA, RNA communication network structure that gives rise to what we call the life plane of existence. Then it's mediated by this kind of imaginal processing. And then you upgrade that. So now you get a dimensional of imagination, imaginal around neurocognition through a brain, and the animal mindedness of sensory motor looping. And it's doing an imaginal in relationship to the biological. So it then drops the imaginal up a degree. So that's a secondary imaginal. And then us, through a proposition, we got a third tertiary imaginal. Yep. Okay. And now we can stack the imaginal languages upon each other. And the relationship is this orthogonal informational relation.
Yes. And then sort of kind of use the metaphor you used earlier. The thing that Matthew and I were talking about is the distinction between the proof of work methodology and the proof of stake methodology is the distinction between the imaginal and the imaginary.
Exactly. Yes. Okay.
Proof of stake has as its sort of, it has a Derrida and a Derrida. Hold on. Just crashed the internet again. Are we back?
Proof of stake. Yes, the last I heard was proof of stake.
Proof of stake is effectively identical, isomorphic to many of the problems we were just discussing in terms of like Derrida's point around language, right? If it's entirely self-referential, if a word means only its relationship to all the other words in a language, then it's not bound to reality. It's not bound to nature. It's not bound to anything other than its own systems of justification. Actually, as it turns out, the only way you even get there is actually already when you've lost the plot and have self-identified the ego, the systems of justification as reality, and then you kind of look around and go, nothing but systems of justification around here, and then you run off on that sort of, in some sense, preordained dead end journey. But you're like, no, there is a way. There is, as you say, hey, if I'm just doing something very simple, like say, hey, would you bring me that hammer? And the loop has a loop that goes from the informational into the energetic, meaning did Gregg actually hear what I was saying, understand it, walk over, grab the object known as hammer and bring it to me? If yes, that loop, right, the loop from the informational down to the energetic back up is real, right? That's part of reality. If you're running in just the algorithmic, just the informational, it's unconnected to reality and is sort of preordained to closure and entropic noise in a finite time, relatively quickly, by the way. But if I'm looping it, then that's just
in complex space. Notice we use the word of complex dynamic space.
Then that's life, right? Then I'm just engaging in adaptive life. And so, so by the way, the hypothesis here, which is, I'm going to say it. I was just going to say, it feels like it may be a big deal, is to say this thing, proof of work, which I learned as a pragmatic notion. Oh, it's a way of solving a particular kind of game theoretic problem, which has resolved a mathematical question around the Byzantine generals problem. Okay, yeah, I could almost like with just inside that book go, okay, look at it and go, oh, okay, I get how it solves that problem. This is a very different proposition, right? The proposition here is say, no. This is the thing that enables the joint point, invoking Gregg H., the joint point of person culture space to actually move to whatever this next level is. That's the thing that I'm pointing at, which is why I had to CC you on this one, right? The proposition is that this thing, proof of work, is the thing that enables computation, which of course is information processing qua information processing. Right? It goes back to that notion. If we're looking now at technology qua technology, not in terms of any artifact of technology, we're looking at computation qua computation, information processing, information theory, information in and of itself. Proof of work is nothing more or less than the mechanism by which that is strictly bound to energy. And that if you don't have energy bound, information bound to energy, then information flies off into an entropic closure, which goes to noise in a finite time. If you do have it bound, then you're beginning to actually do something which is happening in the real, and you can begin to build on that.
Like a complex system.
Like a complex system, yeah. So I'm now a proof of work maximalist.
Yeah. And what that does is it affords a foundational linkage between two foundational concepts, okay, of energy and information on the one hand, okay? And now the ease with which you metabolize what I was saying, once I rotated it a bit, okay, this relationship between these dimensions of complexification, this life, mind, and culture shit, okay, to go back to what I was saying, like we can upgrade the old misunderstandings. The entire enlightenment failed to appreciate how to fucking get from matter in motion into actual, what do we mean by life? What do we mean by mind? What do we mean by culture? Because they were operating on a particular set of assumptions of what the real had to be. Okay. And now that we can point in mathematics to the logical relations between structures, like between real and imaginary numbers, and the orthogonal mapping between those, that actually transpose in the relationship between real and information processing, all right, we are to me, what I'm wondering about is we're affording a particular framing that has long eluded our understanding, basically between matter and mind, ultimately, or between energy into matter, into life, into mind, into culture, into the forms that we are using to map the substances and to create a transjective conforming grip between being and thinking into a clear metaphysics.
Yeah. Yeah, just as a nice, how to say, not even caveat, but just a nice thing put out there. My mind does not handle certain kinds of math particularly well. And I can tell you right now that I've endeavored mightily to understand what the fuck are meant by imaginary numbers. I can get them down to their formulas. I can use them. I can do stuff with it, right? But I kind of got nothing. Like, it feels very weirdly, I almost panic, like, whoa. But, barring that leap right there, the continuity of what you were just describing, and we could probably continue to kind of massage it and hammer on it. I get where you're going. I get the point. Let me see. There's some other things that came up. So yes, I think that. Oh, okay. There's a couple. One is an acknowledgement, a thing that we should acknowledge as a culture. We're on the one hand, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. On the other hand, we're standing on foundations of sand.
Beautifully said.
Right? These are both true. The guys were doing their best with very, very limited frameworks, ability to experiment, coordination capacity, and there's a lot of path-dependent stuff that was many things were swept under the rug. Like, shit, I don't understand how that works. Well, fuck it, I got to figure out how to do this problem over here. Fine, simplify, reify. Hope it doesn't come up until after my job is done, which is a pretty human thing. What kind of human nature? That's a very human thing to do.
Sounds like a reasonable justification.
Yeah, exactly. And it's okay. Like, it's okay for us to actually zoom back and look at something and say, oh, all right, let's take this unexamined for 300 years set of axiomatics. Oh boy, these are really, really not particularly functional. All right, fine. Let's unplug that. Let's expand it back out. See, geez, look at all this structure that was built on top of a bunch of actually quite poor axiomatics. How much of that can we just throw away? Ooh, a lot of it. What can we build new? Oh, neat stuff. Can we plug a lot of old stuff into it? Sure. Because most of the old stuff was actually just pragmatic, having to do with what really works in a real world, right? Or, looping it all the way back, by the way, the technocratic era. The technocratic era is built on top of a lot of those axiomatic errors in a deep way. And it's a problem, right? It's something that the loops have not closed to force the capitulation that it's a problem, but it's a problem. And we can argue that ad nauseum, which
totally.
Matthew actually does quite a good job at in language that doesn't, nobody's going to understand. None of those who are motivated not to understand it will understand it. That's a bit of
right.
But yes, that acknowledgement of saying, hey, we actually are in a position where we can use these things like Zoom dialogos and integrative pluralism to radically upgrade the robustness of the way that we go about thinking about this whole story. We're not beholden to an Enlightenment era or modernist era or late 20th century. Like, we're not beholden to much, if anything, really. I mean, the whole point of this integrative pluralism frame is like, look, Greg and I met, 2 years ago?
If that.
You've got a vast, long lifetime of thinking about lots of things, right? And from a point of view that's not my native point of view, right? I got my own stuff. And yet we've been able to figure out how to achieve generative dialogue effectively instantly. This is a key thing, like immediately. So. And then have continued the process, right? So it's a form of grip, and then it can expand. Yeah, come on. And it's like useful from the very get-go, and continues to have richness, which is nice, right? You don't have to have this, it sucks for 2 years and is useless, then hope it works out and get it payload at the end. You can actually have a nice, smooth, okay, cool, this is an interesting insight. I walk away from this with some increased capacity, more meaningful existence in life and reality, and notice that it just affords more possibility on a go-forward basis.
Totally on my end as well. And that's the synergy of it. And man, we tap that.
Yeah. and now the borrowed time is definitely no longer, it's being called due. So
I hear it.
Good to see you, brother.
All right. Me too. So it's hey man, enjoyed it.
Yeah. Bye-bye.